Charlotte. You got that, Corey, right on tape. If I can, I'm going to play that back over and over again in daily affirmation. It's wonderful introduction. Some of you are going to know some of this, but that's okay. So those of us who teach medieval literature often feel like we need to generate enthusiasm for the works of literature that may seem very distant from things that actually matter today. So this is us teaching the medieval literature. Whoops, this one on the first day of class. Okay, right? What we're afraid of course, is what the title of my talk is meant to capture. You know, Chaucer. Is the irritation. We're afraid of the irritation of disgruntled students begrudgingly fulfilling that pre-1800 requirement. So there's this. Happy body goes away. So at this point in the history of literary study, most medieval lit professors would be unlikely to respond to the question of why Chaucer with one of the ready answers of past generations of teachers, those answers that emphasize his artistic importance in a way that presumed that the discipline of literary study rested upon a canon of great authors. For numerous reasons, including many good ones, we've pushed those answers aside. Instead, then, we teachers might invoke a literary historical justification, assuming that what is studied in English departments is the 1,200-year-long Anglophone literary tradition. We may matter-of-factly assert Chaucer's foundational role in that tradition. Yet, a quick glance through the last several issues of PMLA, the discipline's flagship journal, casts some doubt over whether the Anglophone literary tradition remains, in fact, the field's central object, or even in its top 10. So last year at the MLA convention, there was a session entitled Saving Literary History. So now, the increasingly anxious Chaucer professor might then ask, well, you know, what about Zadie Smith's recent stage adaptation of The Wife of Bath's Prologue and Tale? Surely this suggests that to appreciate such critically acclaimed contemporary authors, we must return to Chaucer. And to that, we can cue the image of Zadie Smith scholars rolling their eyes. So, to be sure, insofar as the discipline of literary study has in some fashion retained an historical dimension, as reflected in that stubborn pre-1800 requirement, the anxious Chaucer professor has a basis for insisting that the historical dimension that historical difference remains an important vector of identity, just as important as those of race, class, gender, and sexuality. But historical difference provides no special justification for any specific author or work, as evident by its curricular realization as pre-1800 whatever. Rather transparently then, if the anxious professor were to claim that a specific author or work, one which happens to have been a long-standing member of the British literary canon, serves as an especially rich example of whatever constitutes pre-1800ness, they would be sneaking canonicity by another name back into the calculus of justification. So, what I've been trying to suggest with these opening comments is the curricular problem with Chaucer is an epiphenomenon of the more general problem of literary value, which, as you heard in the introduction, is a topic by this point is a hobby horse that for some time I've been kicking when it's down. In my 2023 book on this topic, which is this book, which was mentioned, Charlotte mentioned, I consider several examples of the professional incoherencies impelled by the problem of literary value. So for tonight's purposes, we can start with one of those incoherencies, one of my own, from this very book, from the postscript of this very book, which is my version of the lament, Why Chaucer? So I will just read this. Chaucer's de facto position as the father of English poetry carries with it a set of values that has served, and continues to serve, as a legitimating framework for some deeply entrenched injustices. Many of those injustices, obviously, are encapsulated by the phrase white male Eurocentric canon, and the social, cultural, political, and institutional forces that have created that canon in their own image and have installed Chaucer as its English fountainhead continue to have deeply detrimental impact. Moreover, as as many critics have also pointed out, Chaucer's works themselves are scarcely passive vehicles of those forces. Rather, those forces have not had to search very far to find in those works ideological and meaningful content, which is to say, those works themselves are part of those forces. So, the obvious incoherency here is that I could write these lamenting sentences and yet continually to actively choose to teach Chaucer. This registers an unspoken insistence upon some kind of compensatory value held by his works, an enabling silence that is precisely the sort of gap in the logic of disciplinary self-justification that I identify and diagnose in my book. Such gaps, I argue there, are the rule rather than the exception in the field of literary study. What I recommend is that we recognize these gaps' central enabling role in the everyday practice of literary scholarship and teaching, that we seek to exhume the relays of value commitments in our own practice that they obscure, that we acknowledge that those commitments are exactly that rather than, say, facts, and that we explicitly incorporate this process of recognition, identification, and acknowledgement into how we study and teach literature. Or to put this less abstractly, in a curricular environment that typically, as at Agnes Scott, no longer demands that Chaucer be taught, and in which there are some good reasons not to teach him, we are prompted to inquire not just into why we do teach him, but also why we believe his works remain worth reading in and of themselves, regardless of their historical or literary historical significance. In this inquiry, we will necessarily encounter collocations of interpretive conclusions and value commitments that cannot be justified without recourse to a constellation of beliefs that has no firm grounding, but rather possesses both indefinite extent and circular logic. These groundless but unavoidable collocations constitute, in a nutshell, the problem of literary value. But so brought to the surface, they are a good problem because they externalize the meditations upon value that we're always necessarily making in a way that makes them accountable to ourselves and to others. So it's in the spirit of that good problem that my follow-up to this book, The Problem of Literary Value, is this one, which you can much cheaper than the other one. I've sought in this next book to take up my own recommendations. So picking up that thread I left unspooled in the earlier books afterward, and articulating why I nonetheless still believe Chaucer is worth reading. So in the rest of this evening's talk, I'm going to provide a representative sample of my answer, one which my new book directs, as its title indicates, and as you heard, is not so much to experts as to students and to general readers. And so, I mean, I know some of you have actually were among the guinea pigs for this material. I kept mentioning, I'm working on a book in this class. So some of this, so you will find this very familiar. And thanks for serving as those guinea pigs. So, in the suggestion that anyone's writings remain worthwhile in and of themselves, as I just rather incautiously said, the obvious implication is that they possess some characteristic features to which one can attach values of some sort. So let's start by laying those cards on the table. The particular feature of Chaucer's writings that I'll single out has been described in various ways by countless commentators, and I'm sure has been noticed in some fashion by most of its readers. And I'm going to call this laconic profundity. By which I mean his writings so often invoke weighty, even fraught issues with very little fuss or difficulty. These issues frequently seem to arise as a sort of side effect of a particular moment of narration or dialogue, rather than striking us as a calculated underlying motivation. While the issues manifest in a readily perceptible manner, they nonetheless typically remain half submerged and almost always lack accompanying definitive explanations, and so leave open not only the presumed proper responses, but also the precise nature and reach of the issues themselves. For these reasons, this characteristic of Chaucer's writings has often been described more simply as ambiguity, although it does not so much involve, say, ambiguity of character or plot, as the ambiguity of the larger significance that we are to take from character, plot, imagery, genre, etc., even as the presence of such larger significance seems unmistakably signaled. So, the list of larger significances that Chaucer's writing evoke in this way is long and diverse, and here's where I introduce that thing that banal topic that Charlotte mentioned. So at the risk of evaporating into that banality, I'm going to suggest that many of the weightiest entries of these significance may be collected under the rubric of meaning of life. So, as woolly as that hackneyed phrase may be, it may nonetheless supply a focus for a broad set of urgent concerns if we add a dose of specificity to those designations of meaning in life. So, let's take life to denote no more and no less than our physical, corporeal existence, the material realities of birth, hunger, pleasure, suffering, sensation, and death, and others, that which philosopher Giorgio Agamben has termed bare life. Let's take meaning then to denote the incorporeal, or more generally, non-material ideas, ideals, and values that we cannot touch, and yet which altogether seem comprehensively to shape our experience of life. For example, the idea of race, the ideal of equity, the value of integrity. The phrase, the meaning of life, then specifically denotes the relations between our material existence and non-material ideas, ideals, and values. And these relations are obviously enormously complex, ever-evolving, and of the highest stakes there are. The challenges that these relations may present are, as we all know, most keenly felt when the perceived demands or attractions of life seem in some conflict with the key ideas, ideals, or values that one perceives, however cogently, as constituting life's significance and purpose. So to illustrate this with my students, which I just did with any of you in my Arthurian Lit and Film class, I just did this a couple weeks ago, right? I've had them consider the scenario of their graduating with $120,000 in debt and having two job offers. A position with the Coca-Cola company with a starting salary of $120,000 that involves marketing infant formula to a demographic just above the poverty line, or a position teaching American history and critical thinking to high school students, largely to that same demographic with a starting salary of $35,000. Which do you choose, right? Typically, this is what happens. The classroom is silent. Students kind of look at each other, look at me, and maybe down at their desk, and then we move on. It's admittedly a simplistic and contrived quandary. Next to that, we can place all the complexity of literature or art more generally, which of course has long meditated upon, staged, and provoked exactly this general sort of conflict. Chaucer was intensely interested in this conflict in its many and diverse manifestations, and in a moment, I'm going to walk us through one of the most famous instances of it in his work. But, you know, as sort of foreshadowed in my introduction, I'm going to walk us through first one of the most famous instances, a relatively straightforward instance from the 21st century American popular culture, Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games, which is plainly wholly premised on the conflict, depicting with its titular games a situation in which children are seemingly constrained to prioritize life, specifically physical survival, above all other principles, even if this entails killing all 23 of the other child participants, including the other participant from one's home district. So, to choose just one of the novel's many succinct stagings of this conflict, we may recall the conversation between Katniss and Peeta on the rooftop of the training center on the night before they are to enter the arena. And this is the film's depiction of this scene. Peeta attempts to express to Katniss his struggle with identity and principle in the face of the imminent death match. I don't want them to change me in here, he insists. Katniss, neither sharing nor understanding what she silently conceives of as his concern with purity of self, eventually tells him to care about staying alive. Peeta desperately wants his soon-to-be terminated life to amount to more than just life, and he turns to Katniss for some clarity about what that intangible something might be. But she sees such longing for meaning as a dangerous distraction from the physical reality of the imperative of survival. This moment in the novel illustrates how the conflict latent in the phrase, the meaning of life, seems to pivot on the question of whether non-material ideas, ideals, and values, or material existence is the more foundational truth. So Peeta says, I want to die as myself, and Katniss responds with, Who cares, Peta? A moment's consideration, however, discloses that the conflict is not really one between the non-material and material, between meaning and life, but rather between different ways of conceiving each side in relation to the other within a particular socio-political context. Peta, Katniss, and all those under the rule of the capital live within a system in which officially the sovereign authority of the state is the master value to which all things material are subject, as signified most definitively through its power to destroy the bodies of 23 children each year. Peta seems to be proposing competing sources of abstract authority over corporeal life, that of the state versus that of personal authenticity, and he wants his death to be meaningful in respect to that authenticity rather than to the state. Katniss, in contrast, sees no authority but that of the state, within which system of ideas, ideals, and values she wishes to preserve life by a combination of adaptation and resistance. So, for the purposes of this evening, I'm not going to go into all of the in-depth into all the various theoretical resources I've distilled into this formulation of the meaning of life. There are many. There is, of course, the exceptionally long and crowded philosophical tradition that considers the nature of the relations between what I've been designating the material and non-material, which loosely corresponds to the long-standing distinction between the physical and metaphysical, or between the sensible and the intelligible. My most immediate touchstones are some of those French intellectuals that fill up English 280 and who made such a splash in the second half of the 20th century. In particular, my gloss of the phrase, the meaning of life, as the relations between our material existence and non-material ideas, ideals, and values, is a riff on Louis Althusser's famous definition of ideology as the representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Cued, thus, by Althusser, views about the meaning of life, whether tacitly assumed or explicitly argued, are plainly ideological positions. Works of literature across the world and throughout history have been, in this respect, meditations upon ideological fault lines, those discursive configurations in which a dominant ideological systems underlying incoherencies make themselves felt, or where competing ideologies collide. In the passage from the Hunger Games, Peta is struggling to articulate a counter-ideology, one that is worth dying for, in confrontation with the official state ideology that demands that he fight for his life. In contrast, Katniss, in her very focus on survival, is perpetuating the state ideology, and over the course of the trilogy, as you all know that have read this, her growing awareness of competing ideologies becomes one of the main drivers of the plot. So funneling all this down, back into the question of why Chaucer, my answer is that, on the one hand, I found that the ideological fault lines to which Chaucer is relentlessly, even obsessively drawn, remain in some historically transposed form, fault lines in our own day, and indeed those very historical transpositions, the effort to make them, cast into relief the complexities of the present by way of a play of similarity and difference. And on the other hand, I found that Chaucer's exploration of such fault lines by way of his characteristic laconic profundity nudges us into these ideological crevices with a remarkably light touch, leaving us all the more prompted to reflect how we got there. So, finally, the example of this. This is an 18-line passage that anyone who's ever been assigned to read Chaucer, because there's many of you in this room, will immediately recognize and perhaps was required to memorize. Yes, it is. The first sentence of the Canterbury Tales. A sentence that is lengthier and more rhetorically heightened than is usual for Chaucer, but nonetheless, it can be easily, readily parsed into two halves. The adverbial clause of the first 11 lines and the independent clause of the remaining 7. And it's that structure, as I'm sure many of you are anticipating, that constitutes Chaucer's simple but profound trick. So, I'm going to read first read and think about first the opening adverbial clause, and feel free to join me if. Wandered April with her shore of salt after dropped a match and fastened to the rota, and battered every vein and switched the core, of which virtue engendered is the fluor, when Zephyrus eke with a sway to breath, son happen the ram his half course run, and smaller fullers mark and melodea, that sleeping on the nick with open air, so pick at him, not sure, and her courageous. Pause. All right. What I ask my students about this, as some of you know, is what's being said in its most simplest way here, and it's quite obvious. It's in spring, right? So in this is clearly an over-the-top, extravagantly verbose way to announce that it's springtime. And that very excessiveness signals that there's something weighty and important to notice about this otherwise simple fact. One such obvious something is the principle of the renewal of life, an idea that the lines situate within and across a natural landscape. So, some high stylistic features as the figuration of the west wind as the sweet breath of Zephyrus and the description of the seasonal movement of the sun with the astrological periphrasis, hath in the ram his half course of run, those together elevate this principle of renewal to cosmic proportions. In this way, the first 11 lines seem to evoke a happy vision of a universe of life-regenerating forces that work together harmoniously, cyclically, and endlessly. As several Chaucer scholars have recently suggested, this happy vision has resonance with the diverse collection of modern critical approaches that fall under the label the new materialisms. This sort of work has emphasized the continuity between human corporeality and the material existence of everything else, rejecting such neatly categorical dualisms as those between subject and object, form and matter, culture and nature, soul and body, and the distinctively human and the merely animal. Inquiring critically into the systemic conditions that give rise to such dualisms, the new materialisms are acutely interested in the meaning of life as I've defined that phrase. By situating life within the complex material systems from which it is inseparable, the new materialisms in effect ask not what sort of meanings explain life, but what sort of meanings life and all its dimensions of embeddedness has engendered. So, if we bring that lens to the first 11 lines of the Canterbury Tales, we notice that the passage puts emphasis on life precisely in its rich continuity with its material environment. We see, for example, rain. We see that, for example, that rain, flowers, wind, woods, heath, sun, and birds constitute a dynamic system of life-regenerating interdependencies that we might term ecological. To our initial happy conclusion, then, we can add the particular way that the passage develops the principle of renewal dovetails with the new materialist conception of material existence as active, relational, and systemic, an existence that is necessarily becoming rather than statically being. We may declare that the cyclic regeneration of the passage, that the passage celebrates is environmental in something like the way that we use that term today. Less happy conclusions emerge, however, if we follow the lead of scholar Emma Maggie Solberg and give notice to the all too human resonances of the same passage. In particular, alongside and within the natural landscape descriptions lies a vein of heterosexual imagery of a masculinist character. So, these words. The first 4 lines tell us that new life, the engendering of flowers, comes about through a process that involves penetration in a potent liquid that washes through the passive vessels of plants. In the following line, this preceding imagery activates the masculinity latent in the otherwise conventional name for the west wind, Zephyrus, whose sweet breath similarly penetrates the tender crops, with the adjective tender possessing a range of meanings that includes feminizing ones. With the little birds who are too busy to sleep, then we are given an almost literal explanation of the preceding imagery. Norms of heterosexuality, masculinity, and femininity circulate through the passage, and crucially, these norms cannot be disentangled from the passage's simultaneous development of an ecological principle of cosmic renewal. As Solberg argues, from our post-Me Too perspective, the passage's, quote, cosmic beauties and gorgeous pleasures, unquote, may be understood to naturalize patriarchal violence so that the, quote, consent, agency, and subjectivity of the feminized object have no place. Unquote. What seemed an unbeat vision of cosmic environmental harmony may also serve to transmit an ideologies of heteronormativity and male supremacy precisely by representing those ideologies as necessary facts of nature. Indeed, if the remainder of the sentence proceeded in the way that the first time readers had reason to expect, those ideologies would likely be straightforwardly in play. In the conventions of late medieval romance on which Chaucer is riffing, what ought to follow these lines is a stereotypical plot in which hyper-masculine male protagonists, through violent competition with one another, obtain the sexual possession of a desired, idealized female object. In such stories, the movement of characters through the plot, culminating, say, with the heterosexual coupling of masculine hero and feminine desired object, serves as an expansive insistence that what's natural in human life are the principles that supposedly govern nature as a whole. The knight and the princess are, at the end, the happy birds making melody. Accordingly, the reigning social order is understood as underwritten by those same universal principles of nature. Obviously, however, the sentence does not proceed in that direction. Instead, when Chaucer on the 12th line finally supplies the sentence's long-delayed main subject and verb, he makes an abrupt U-turn. Instead of his telling us, say, like, in springtime, a doughty knight rides through a forest, we learn instead this. And I'll read this too. Whoa, what happened there? No idea. There we go. Then longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and Palmera's for to Satan's strongest strongest, to fair the howers coolth in sundry longest, and especially from every Shiraz end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful matter for to sega that ham hath holpen when that they were sega. So, on the one hand, in respect to the initiation of an adventure in a faraway place and time that readers had reason to expect from the clause, this comes across as a sudden, rather deflating observation about ordinary life in Chaucer's England. In springtime, when the weather makes travel more practical, English folk are able to go on pilgrimages. But on the other hand, this seemingly ordinary observation potentially cancels all that led up to it, supplying a vision of the cosmos, that is an ideology, that may seem directly antithetical to the one painted by the preceding lines. This competing vision is, to give it a one-word label, penitential. More specifically, it's the penitential ideology that views human corporeal existence as a series of spiritual tests that involve most basically the challenges of corporeality itself, the temptation to value the bodily over the spiritual. The late medieval penitential system both propagated this view and served as a kind of pressure release valve for it, promising and no doubt often providing access to a life experience felt to be meaningful and good. Pilgrimage, of course, was in Chaucer's day an act of penance. That is, it was a normative part of this system. So one possible explanation of the 12th line's U-turn then is that in the first 11 lines, Chaucer purposely leads the reader astray in order to provide a shock of spiritual correction. Those first 11 lines develop an ideology that seems to celebrate material regeneration and even especially sexual reproduction. Corporeality seems valuable for its own sake, although the consideration of these lines through the lens of gender and sexuality cautions us against understanding this embrace as a simple prioritization of the material over the non-material. Rather, as an ideology, it defines the specific relations between the material and non-material, for example, by construing the material as signifying the idea of heteronormativity, which is elevated to a cosmic principle. What the U-turn may reveal is thus that very elevation functions as a sort of concusscent temptation, an ideology in which carnality, rather than a source of sin, epitomizes cosmic renewal. The final 7 lines abruptly overturn that ideology by means of a sudden reversal of values in which the spiritual, the non-material par excellence, emerges triumphant over the now degraded material. Corporeal existence now signifies its own objection and the greater value of precisely what it is not. The very structure of the passage in this way performs a penitential act in miniature, supplying a thematic act of spiritual good work in recompense for the thematic sin of the sentence's long opening adverbial clause. Such a pious interpretation of the first sentence in one variation or another has, in fact, had many advocates. A difficulty with this view, one of many, is that there are, in fact, no explicit lexical or syntactic markers of contradiction or reversal in the sentence. So here's the whole sentence again. There's nothing that assuredly signals any logical tension between the first 11 lines and the remaining 7. Rather, the opening adverbial clause connects smoothly and elegantly with the rest of the sentence. So this is then what I am identifying as the instance of Chaucer's laconic profundity in this case. What are we to make of a passage that apparently presents binary opposing ideologies, but in its linguistic structure appears wholly unified? One explanation, perhaps the U-turn is not a U-turn at all. Taking our cue from the sentence's smooth syntactic transition, we might interpret the first 11 lines as establishing an affirmative context for or even prefiguring the final 7, so that the happy regeneration of the material world, which necessarily includes human regeneration through procreation, reflects and stands as evidence for the even happier spiritual regeneration provided by God's grace and available to humans in such penitential activities as pilgrimage. As appealingly unifying as this alternative interpretation may be, however, it creates at least as many problems as it solves. In its very identification of a parallel, it simultaneously calls attention to key differences between, say, the physical world's cyclical recovery from winter and the spiritual penitential recovery from sin. Further scrutiny of the first sentence helps to give these difficulties more specificity. In particular, my characterization of the transition between the two main components of the sentence as smooth was a little bit overstated, as in fact, immediately prior to the transition, following a rhythmically fluid series of 5 couplets, we bump into the somewhat disruptive parenthetical remark. That one, so precavum natur in her courages. When the passage is recited aloud, this digressive retrospective comment urges a temporary modulation in tone and pace, which is to say, the line calls attention to itself. One might notice then that not only is the line syntactically intrusive, but also, along with the 12th line, it forms a couplet whose union of terminal rhyme words sits uncomfortably astride both the grammatical division of adverbial and main clauses and the thematic division of matter and spirit. Situated in this way, the couplet focuses questions of ideological significance on specific parallels between its two lines, between the apparently sexual desire that nature has pricketh in the courages, the hearts of the small fowls, the small birds, and the next line's apparently spiritual desire, that of the folk who desire to go on pilgrimages. What are the continuities and discontinuities between these two desires, between courages and pilgrimages, and between fowls, birds, and people? Do the continuities ideologically outweigh the discontinuities, or is it vice versa, so that the categorical superiority of the spiritual winds up being reinforced precisely through its momentary juxtaposition with the carnal? And to these inquiries, we may add the further observation that nature, as evident by its editorial capitalization here, denotes not just what we mean by the force of nature, but also the Christian Neoplatonic figuration of that force as the goddess natura, the vicaress of God, the divine agency responsible for the harmonious unity of the physical world. With the introduction of this figure, the question of the distinction or lack thereof between sexual longing and spiritual longing takes on cosmic proportions. In turn, the figure of nature and the ambiguities generated by this couplet amplify and complicate the significance of what we notice about the passage by way of gender and sexuality. We may now observe that in contrast with Zephyrus, the penetrating actor here, the goddess nature, is tacitly gendered feminine, and the penetrated bodies, the fowls, are not specifically gendered. Either they're conventionally male songbirds, or penetrated by a female force, or the plural signifies general sexual activity regardless of gender. For these reasons, although the idea of procreation plainly still predominates, the 11th line may seem to move some steps away from the sexual norms that the preceding lines develop, despite, again, my earlier suggestion of continuity in this respect. And perhaps it strays far enough to say that it queers those norms. Notably, folk is also plural and seemingly gender inclusive, as is Palmer's, and these two collective actors govern the rest of the sentence. We might therefore understand couplet's incipient queering of norms to extend to the spiritual realm, thereby further blurring the matter-spirit distinction. Alternatively, we might see that distinction as reinforced with the genderless folk and Palmer's signaling a turn away from sexuality by way of their very juxtaposition with the genderless fowls or birds. There's much else to notice in these respects among the details of the passage, such as the significance of the concluding homophonic rhyme. But I hope that this retracing of this famous sentence has illustrated how it almost effortlessly proliferates weighty issues by its trick of syntax, and how it seeks neither to resolve the accompanying ideological contradictions nor even to identify those issues and contradictions as such. Moreover, these issues plainly still matter to us, and the very historical digging through the language and through the references that it takes to recover the passage's range of reference performs the work of bringing to fore their urgency. We are prompted to contemplate, for example, whether corporeal existence has any value beyond the spiritual or ethical trials that it supplies. If the answer to that question is affirmative, the passage then asks what that value is, whether and how it may be reconciled with spiritual or ethical values, and what sort of ideological baggage all those values, as well as their reconciliation, carry. Such questions as these underlie our large life decisions, such as what sort of career to pursue, as well as minor everyday ones, such as how much money to spend on a good bottle of wine. Here and elsewhere, Chaucer's laconic profundity, if we follow its piper song, leads us into a forest of ambiguity from which emerge questions that demand answers that only we can supply. It's this feature of Chaucer's writing, then, among some others, that has led me to continue to teach and write about him, and thereby, in my own small way, reinforce the trouble of his canonicity. And I make this choice, as I admitted at the outset, knowing that neither this nor any other particular literary value can supply any truly firm ground for privileging one author over another. Attempts at such justification, I know, necessarily involve recourse to other values in a relation that is ultimately exhibiting in this way a contradiction that lies at the heart of literary study, and one that I can imagine would make Chaucer smile. And that's your Chaucer lesson. Y'all want to do this? Question?
Okay, forgive me. This is kind of like an everywhere thought, but if you think that like Chaucer is so easily applicable to like modern times in the sense of teaching college students, do you feel the same way about teaching maybe high school students?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
How would you like go about that?
I mean, the challenge, of course, is that this is already difficult for college students, right? And so in high school, you've got so many other things you're trying to accomplish in the literature classroom. But Chaucer, I believe, is taught at the high school level, right? This is some of you might know this.
Right.
And it's sometimes taught in translation, which loses a lot, unfortunately. You know, I think high school students in particular are these questions like the ones that I've, you know, these questions about the meaning of life, as I call them, I mean, are, at least when I was becoming that age, those questions were first occurring to me in a big way, right? Because you're beginning to think on your own, you're beginning to think differently from your parents, you think differently from your teachers, and you want to know, maybe for the first time in your life, what the larger stakes of those questions are, and whether they're going to lead you the same direction as, you know, your family or whatever. So yeah, I would say so. But it's, you know, again, a lot of times in high school too, you're